Hi, I'm Tom Friedland. I'm president of the Berkeley City Club, and I want to welcome everyone to tonight's program. Let me especially welcome our club members and apologize to them for the fact that the Omicron virus is temporarily slowing our in-person activities. But I'm glad that we're able to at least do by Zoom tonight's meeting, which I think everybody will love. Let me turn my attention to non-club members. If you're a Bay Area non-club member, I'd like to invite you, A, to join the City Club, B, to eat at our great Julia's restaurant, and C, to invite any of your out-of-town relatives, friends, other visitors to stay at the Berkeley City Club Hotel. And if you're not a Bay Area resident, when you visit the Bay Area, I'd like to invite you to do the same, to stay at our hotel and to eat at Julia's. And with that, I'm going to turn the microphone over to my wife, Sandy, who's in charge of the Arts and Culture program. Thank you all.
Hi, I'm co-chair of the Arts and Culture program, along with Wendy Rubman. And again, I'm sorry that we're back on Zoom. We did this for quite a while, 16 programs, and we were hoping that we wouldn't be back, but this also enables us to reach a far wider audience. So we welcome you all. Even if you don't recall the exact date, you probably remember where you were when you heard that Ruth Bader Ginsburg had died. Like the explosion of the Challenger, or like those of us who are old enough, the assassination of President Kennedy, her death on September 18th, 2020, profoundly affected us, both personally and as citizens. We are still reeling from the loss of the notorious RBG, especially as our democracy seems more fragile than ever before. Just 11 months before Justice Ginsburg died, our speaker tonight, Berkeley law professor Amanda Tyler, interviewed her at an event at the law school. It was during that visit here that the two decided to collaborate, to publish the justice's writings and anecdotes, the ones they felt most epitomized her life's work. As Professor Tyler writes in the introduction to what would become this inspiring book, she and the justice wanted us to see, and I quote, how as a lawyer and a federal judge, she worked tirelessly for gender equality and more generally, the achievement of our Constitution's most fundamental aspiration to build a more perfect union. Ever the brilliant persuader, the justice also used this book as leverage. She told the University of California Press that publishing her book was contingent on also publishing the book of her dear friend, the late Irma Hill Kay, the first woman dean of Berkeley Law, which formerly, as many of you know, was called Bolt Hall. Dean Kay's book, called Paving the Way, chronicles the first 14 women law professors in America. I know Professor Tyler will talk more about the evolution of Justice, Justice, Thou Shalt Pursue, completed just 3 weeks before Justice Ginsburg died. She also will share what it was like to work together during the final year of her life, when she was particularly reflective and had embraced, with some humor, her newfound celebrity as a role model for her legions of young fans. I just have to add here that I can't remember another book that had me in tears by page 2 of the introduction. Professor Tyler clerked for Justice Ginsburg from 1999 to 2000, and they maintained a close relationship for the next 2 decades. She was one of the 120 clerks of Justice Ginsburg who, despite the pandemic, flocked to Washington, D.C. to maintain a vigil over the justice's casket as it lay in state at the US Capitol, and later to serve as honorary pallbearers. A legal force in her own right, Professor Tyler's research and teaching interests include, and there's probably more of these, the Supreme Court, federal courts, constitutional law, legal history, civil procedure, and statutory interpretation. She's one of the country's leading experts in habeas corpus and has won awards both for her writing and her teaching. Before she joined Berkeley Law, Professor Tyler taught at George Washington University Law School. She graduated with honors and distinction from Stanford University and magna cum laude from Harvard Law School. Unless you think she spends all her time in legal pursuits, You should know that she played Division I soccer at Stanford and is a dedicated runner. At last count, she had completed 19 marathons, including 11 in Boston, and is training for another Boston Marathon and the New York Marathon. She lives in Berkeley with her husband, who also is a lawyer, and he works in national security, and their 2 children. It's my great honor and pleasure to introduce Professor Amanda Tyler.
Hi, everyone, and thank you so much to Sandy and Tom for welcoming me. I am remiss, or I should say, I'm sorry that we're not together in person. I had so looked forward to doing this event in person at the beautiful City Club, which is just a gem of a piece of architecture. But I'm thrilled all the same that because we're on Zoom, we are able to reach perhaps outside just the Bay Area to welcome many of you. So thank you for coming tonight and for your interest in RBG. As you heard, I had the great privilege, and it truly was a privilege and an honor, of working for her as a law clerk from 1999 to 2000. As some of you may know, each of the justices on the Supreme Court typically has 3 or 4 law clerks who are relatively recent law school graduates working for them each year. And then they turn over and they have a new group so that this incredible experience can be enjoyed by more young lawyers. It was an unbelievable experience. It is an experience that, as you will hear, shaped the entirety of my life because of all that she taught me about how to be a great lawyer, but also a good human person, a good person, and how to live a good and rich life. She remained an important mentor, really a North Star in my life in the 2 decades since I clerked for her. And I'm very grateful that I was able to do many events with her over the years, interview her on several occasions, and as you heard, interview her at UC Berkeley in the fall of 2019. I will tell you a little bit more about that, but first I want to start by telling you a story from my clerkship. When I clerked for Justice Ginsburg in 1999, that was an eventful year in her life, because in the summer of 1999, she was diagnosed for the first time with cancer, in that case, colorectal cancer. The press and really, frankly, her entire chambers thought that she would not be on the bench on the first day of oral argument that term, which always happens on the first Monday of October. The reason we thought this is because she had major surgery, I think something like 8 or 9 days before the first day of the term, and she had already started undergoing very aggressive cancer treatments. And so you can imagine my surprise when I went into chambers that morning and I was the only one there. Everyone else came in late because they assumed she wouldn't come in, and the phone rang and I answered it. And on the other line was the justice calling from the car to tell me, Amanda, please run down to the Chief Justice's chambers and make sure he knows that I'm coming. It was, as you can imagine, an assignment that I relished. And it really, in my view, speaks volumes about the justice and her dedication to her job, her love of serving the American people in that role, and her deep devotion that governed throughout her entire life of wanting to make a contribution, to use her talents to make a contribution, to make our society better. And I think it also tells you a lot about her work ethic. And I can tell you firsthand from having worked for her that her work ethic was unbelievable. She was the hardest working person I have ever met. And I spent some years after I clerked for her thinking about where that all came from. And I asked her about that when she came to Berkeley in 2019. I asked her, why is it that you were able to work so hard? Does it go back to when you were in law school? And she answered, yes. It goes back to when she and her husband, Marty, her beloved husband, Marty, about whom I'll say a few more words later on, they were in law school together at Harvard Law School. Marty was a year ahead of her, and he had a very serious bout with cancer. So serious, in fact, that it was not at all clear that Marty would survive. The justice at this time was taking her own classes. She was on law review. They had a toddler at home, and she was going constantly back and forth to the hospital and managing all of Marty's friends to take notes for him, while then having them come and teach Marty, cooking and taking care of him in the middle of the night. And she was, as she described it, helping him by typing his final paper for law school through all of this. And somehow in all of this, she managed to come out near the very top of her class. In fact, when she later graduated, she graduated tied for first in her class. So I had the occasion to ask her about all of this, and I'd like to take a moment and share my screen and share with you a little video of the justice and what she had to say after talking about all of this.
Well, maybe that was part of making Marty so eager to get me out of the kitchen. But
Apologize.
in any
Take this forward a little bit.
we just took each day as it came, and we were going to prevail. I think after those hard months, I decided that whatever came my way, I could handle it.
When you look back, was there any silver lining to Marty getting sick so early in your family?
Well, one was, and I know now from my own personal experience, if you have survived cancer, you have a zest for life that you didn't have before. That you count each day as a blessing.
Now, because Marty graduated a year ahead of you,
I hope you enjoyed hearing from the justice directly. I have to say that even now, watching videos of her and listening to her speak is still actually quite hard for me because I miss her terribly. But you got a window there into how she thought about life, how she thought about the road ahead as they were coming through this enormously challenging and trying time in their lives, which they did come through. And you hopefully have an appreciation for how so many of us who knew her came to think of her really as superhuman because of all that she was capable of doing. And I think that is a lot of the explanation as to how she was able to accomplish so much in her life. Now, stepping back for a minute, I want to tell you a little bit more about the book and how it came to be. As you heard from Sandy, the book is an outgrowth of that video, that interview that you just witnessed, that she and I planned meticulously. And here I should pause and say that Justice Ginsburg was always one to plan meticulously. She never shot from the hip. And if you ever did anything with her, there were many, many drafts that went back and forth as you planned anything. And that was true with this interview. And in fact, we went through so many drafts that we decided at the end of all of it that maybe there was a book there. We could take the interview where we walk through all parts of her life from childhood all the way through her time on the Supreme Court. And she talks about her family and her marriage, her time as an advocate, all of the story of RBG's life. And we could build a book around that. And so that is what we did. We built the book by borrowing different segments of materials from different parts of her life to complement the story of her life as she told it in the interview. But also, as you heard, Justice Ginsburg was never one to do things just for herself. And one of the most important things she ever taught me was to use your position to lift up the voices of others. And she knew as we were working on this project that her dear friend Herma Hill Kay's book, Paving the Way, the story of the first American women law professors, for whom RBG had written an introduction back in 2015, remained unpublished. And so we presented our book to UC Press. And we said, you can have it, but you have to take Herma's book too. And happily, they went for the deal. And I will tell you, in the last year of the justice's life, she called me every week, if not multiple times a week, asking about the progress of Herma's book. It was so important to her to see her lifelong friend, with whom she wrote the very first casebook on gender-based discrimination in the law, to see the work of Herma in print. And it was also so important to her because the work itself tells the stories of the women who paved the way for Herma and RBG in the legal academy. And RBG was always intent on highlighting and celebrating the women who came before her and did so much work to pave the way for her to pick up the work in turn. So let me tell you a little bit more about the book and a little bit more about my experience with Justice Ginsburg. Now, there were a lot of chapters to her life, as surely you all know. And one of the most important was her time as an advocate. I have said this repeatedly, and I will say it again. If she had never been on the Supreme Court, I think we would be celebrating her just as much as we are now. And that is because of all that she accomplished as an advocate. And I had the chance to talk with her extensively in the interview about this period of her life. And it's really quite remarkable, I can say, as a law professor, looking at the legal landscape that she inherited in the late 1960s to see all that she accomplished in the 1970s. If you go back even earlier in the 20th century, there are tons of Supreme Court opinions, including one in particular, Mueller versus Oregon, in which the Supreme Court says a woman's place is in the home. And in Mueller, they say a woman, no matter what the law says, the law can say she's equal, but she will always look to man for her protection. As late as 1961, the Supreme Court unanimously decided cases in which it held that cities and communities and states could exclude women from jury pools because states could assume that a woman, that their better place was really at the center of home and family life. They weren't needed to participate in civic responsibilities. We only needed to ask men. So fast forward now to the early 1970s, and RBG and a team of amazing lawyers at the ACLU Women's Rights Project, which she co-founded, decide to tackle this problem. And by the end of the 1970s, the Supreme Court had held that the Equal Protection Clause in the United States Constitution promised equality not just to the races, but also to the genders. And in so doing, she toppled one discriminatory law after another. The book, as I said, walks the reader through this career, this part of her career, and the incredible feats that she accomplished. She argued 6 cases before the Supreme Court, winning 5 of those. She filed briefs in more than 24 cases during the 1970s. She was also, meanwhile, I should note, remember I talked about what a hard worker she was, raising a family, being the first woman tenured law professor at Columbia, riding up a storm, and also litigating a lot of cases in the lower courts that we don't hear about, including one that she worked on with none other than Gloria Steinem. And one of the most fun things about this book after the fact for me has been the opportunity that I had last spring to interview Gloria Steinem about working with RBG on that case. Meanwhile, the ACLU Women's Rights Project wasn't just in court. They were also pushing for landmark legislation like Title IX, like the Pregnancy Discrimination Act, and lots of other gender equality legislation. Now, we talk in the book about some of her favorite cases from this period, and a couple of interesting things are worth highlighting. As you may know, a lot of her clients were men, and people constantly ask, why did she do that? You have to remember who her audience was. 9 men on the Supreme Court. We don't get the first woman until Sandra Day O'Connor in 1981. So the justice knew her audience, and she believed, correctly as it turns out, that if she was going to convince the High Court that gender equality was problematic, she needed to convince them that it ran in many directions and had a lot of unintended consequences. And several of her clients helped her do that. One of the very first was a man named Charles Moritz, who was denied a taxpayer deduction that anyone else would have received, but only unmarried, never married men could not receive. But he sought it because he sought to take care of his aging mother. That case is famously featured in the movie On the Basis of Sex, which the justice's nephew wrote. What is so important and special about that case, beyond it, of course, being the first major case that she litigated in this field, is that she did it with Marty. He's the one who found the case. Marty was a great tax lawyer and flagged it to her attention. One of the things that we include in the book is the brief that Marty and RBG wrote and filed in that case, which has never before been published. And it gives a window into the plan, the sort of framework that she intended to follow and that she did follow in the 1970s. And it shows that she was incredibly ambitious from the beginning, hoping to see gender treated just like race in the court's jurisprudence. Charles Moritz wasn't her only male client. Another one was a man named Stephen Weisenfeld, and we've included the transcript of the oral argument that she delivered in that case in the book. Weisenfeld was a widower whose wife had died in childbirth, and he wanted to stay home with his son. But the Social Security laws did not give him benefits. They would have given his wife benefits if he had died, but not the widower. And so he sued. And Justice Ginsburg took his case from the beginning in the trial court and told him at the outset, this is going to go all the way to the Supreme Court. She talked very affectionately about the case and the client. He was very special to her, and she kept in touch with him throughout her life, and she followed the baby's life. Interestingly enough, he later went on to graduate from Columbia Law School, just like the justice did. She had many other cases, and I'm happy to talk about them in the Q&A. But the important thing is that she worked really hard to craft cases one by one that would bring the justices along and get them where she wanted them to go. They never went as far as she wanted. She wanted strict scrutiny of all gender-based discriminatory laws, but she got them very far. And that was the product of her very careful strategy throughout these cases. By the end of the 1970s, whatever the scrutiny was that the court was applying, most, if not all, gender-based discrimination became suspect. And women were no longer what she liked to call the darlings of the law. As an aside, I will tell you that one question I didn't get to ask her in the interview, but that we had talked about beforehand, was whether the portrayal of her in the movie On the Basis of Sex as faltering at the podium when she argued the Moritz case in the 10th Circuit was accurate. And she looked at me as only RBG could, and she said, "Don't be ridiculous, Amanda. Of course I didn't falter." And that has to have been true because, as I said, she was always, always at the top of her game and the best prepared person in the room. Now, the next part of the book explores her time as a justice. And we sometimes forget that she was a lower court judge before she was a justice on the Supreme Court. In fact, she was a judge on the United States Court of Appeals for the DC Circuit, one of the federal appellate courts, for 13 years before President Clinton put her on the Supreme Court in 1993. Originally nominated by President Carter among a wave of women judges, she joined the DC Circuit in 1980. That means, all told, she was a federal judge for 40 years, over which time she wrote over 1,400 opinions and some 700 on the Supreme Court. What we did with this section was really fun. I asked the justice at the outset, if someone who is not a law student or a lawyer who practices constitutional law wants to read just a handful of your opinions from your time as a justice, which opinions would you like them to read? And she picked 4, and we have included those 4 here with some annotations at the beginning. First and foremost, we have included her crown jewel of an opinion, and here I'm using my own description. her opinion in a case called Virginia Military Institute. That case presented the justice in 1996 with the opportunity to write for a court in a gender discrimination case. And so it was very special to her. The case involved the question whether VMI, a state institution, could exclude women cadets from its student ranks. VMI sought to do so, and when sued, proposed that it would create a separate freestanding new institution for female cadets. That institution would not have had the same legacy, would not have had the same alumni base, would not have had the same facilities or the same faculty. But Virginia proposed it as close enough to equal. In an opinion that commanded all but one justice, Justice Ginsburg wrote for the court that VMI would have to open its doors to female cadets because the opportunities at the proposed new institution would not be equal. And in a line that resonates very powerfully, she said the Constitution should be understood to promise everyone the equal opportunity to aspire, achieve, participate in, and contribute to society based on their individual talents and capacities. This is what drove Justice Ginsburg. This was the belief that this was sort of the core belief that drove her jurisprudence. The belief that the Constitution promises each of us the full opportunity to be our best selves, to achieve, as she wrote in that opinion, our full human potential. Now, the VMI case was very special to her, and we talk about this in the interview. It was special for a lot of reasons. One, as I've alluded to, it was a major gender discrimination case, and it gave her the opportunity to write for a court while citing all of these cases from the 1970s that she had won as an advocate. So that was special. Another thing that was special about it, as she told me as we were working on the book, and I write about there, is that the opinion originally landed on Justice Sandra Day O'Connor's lap. But Justice O'Connor said, I think Justice Ginsburg should have it. And I can tell you, talking with Justice Ginsburg about this, even in the last months of her life, she remained immensely grateful to Justice O'Connor for that gesture and opportunity. And she told me that she thought of Justice O'Connor as akin to a big sister. So she had a deep affection for her. Another thing we talk about in the book that I think is really important to know and to understand about Justice Ginsburg is that VMI was actually the culmination, or the sort of bookend, if you will, to a case that she had litigated unsuccessfully in the 1970s. The one case, or one of the cases, I should say, one of the few cases that she lost in the Supreme Court was a case called Vorchheimer. And Vorchheimer was a case that involved a challenge to two high schools in Philadelphia for gifted students. There was one for boys and one for girls. The boys, I'm going to tell you the same story, had better facilities, better faculty, better classes, better opportunities than the girls. So the group of girls said, we want to go to that high school, and they sued. Interestingly, when the case went to the Supreme Court after the lower court had upheld the existing arrangement, Justice Ginsburg and the ACLU were brought in by the original lawyer, and they wrote the opening brief. But the original lawyer decided that she wanted to litigate the case under a different theory. So she effectively fired the ACLU, and Justice Ginsburg wrote the reply brief herself without their help and argued the case herself instead of having RBG argue it. The Supreme Court split 4-4 in Vorchheimer. And what happens when the court splits or ties is the lower court decision is affirmed without becoming a Supreme Court precedent. In other words, the girls in Vorchheimer lost. That loss ate at Justice Ginsburg, as she told me, for almost 20 years until she was finally able to make it right and effectively overrule Vorchheimer, writing for the court in VMI. Now, the one justice who dissented in that case was Justice Scalia, and I'll come back to that. But you know about RBG as notorious because of her dissents. And it's interesting that when I asked her what opinions she would most like people to read from her tenure on the court, overwhelmingly, she chose dissents. In fact, every other opinion she designated, except for VMI, is a dissent. I think there are a lot of reasons for this. One, she was very proud of several of her high-profile dissents, including in particular her dissent in Shelby County versus Holder, a really important voting rights case. She understood and appreciated in a way that 5 justices did not in that case, that we still have a long way to go on voting rights. She celebrates also, in her opinion in that case, all that the Constitution could achieve and all that it aspires to achieve. She talks about that more perfect union that we are called on to work toward in the preamble to the Constitution. And she talks about how our core value is equal citizenship stature. So this was one of the dissents of which she was incredibly proud. And I think recent events have really borne out the wisdom in her position in that case. But she included other dissents as well. Why? I think she wanted to leave a roadmap for people to continue the work. Obviously, as we were working on this book in the final year of her life, she knew that her time was limited. And I think she wanted to include a sort of call to arms to people who would pick up this book to keep doing the work. The dissents involve race issues, voting issues, gender issues, and reproductive rights issues, all issues on which there is still a lot more work to be done. The final, or next to final thing that we included in the book were her final speeches from her life. And here you see a woman who is reflecting on a life well lived, who talks to us about the influences that were so important in her life, the women role models, the Jewish role models she had. She talks about her family. She talks in one very special speech, and I made sure that at least when we submitted the manuscript, this was the last thing in the book, a naturalization ceremony speech. In there, she talks about how proud she was to be the child of immigrants, how happy she was that her family came to a country that welcomed them with open arms and gave them refuge from the horrors that were being wielded on Jews in Europe. She talks about what makes our country special. She quotes de Tocqueville, who said that we're not great because we're better than other people or we're more enlightened. What makes America special is because it faces its faults and it works to overcome them. She calls on the new citizens in that speech to join in the work of building a more perfect union. And I think this is something that is really important to understand about Justice Ginsburg. She never believed that it was for her as a judge to do all of this work. She spoke at both her confirmation proceedings and in this speech, which was one of the last speeches she ever gave, that it's up to all of us. Constant realization of a more perfect union, she said, that the Constitution aspires for us to achieve requires the widest, broadest, deepest participation on matters of government and government policy. So you get a window into who she was and how proud she was of her family and her roots and all that she had come through to get to where she was. Now, a few remarks about my relationship with her and what she taught me. She taught me so much. If I actually just talked about that, I could be up here for hours, but we don't have hours. So I thought about the few major things that she taught me that I want to share with you. I talked about her work ethic. She, as part of that, held herself to the very highest standards. She really emphasized that to her law clerks. Get it right. Keep working until it is, as she liked to say, just right. And so that meant if you were working with her on an opinion, it went back and forth many, many times, sometimes dozens of times. And you kept working and you kept trying to get it to the point where she would return it with no edits on it and just right written in the upper corner. She always taught us, though, I do want to say this, she would sit you down and she would walk you through line by line the edits she made, because she always thought of herself as a teacher and a mentor, not just a boss who was extracting work from us. She taught us through all of this to be precise, to care passionately about our writing and about language and about words. Now, where did that come from? She studied under Nabokov at Cornell as an undergraduate, who once said that you can paint pictures with words. And that's what she tried to do. And I think if you read her opinions, particularly the ones we included in the book, you will see that she was a truly gifted writer. She taught me about perseverance. I can tell so many stories on this front. A few. She taught me to believe in myself, and where there's a will, there's a way. That's a special phrase to me, because when I had my first child and went back to work, I wrote her a letter and I said, I'm really nervous about this. I don't know how now I'm going to balance my career with my family life. Everything seems so much more consequential now that there's a young child at home. And she wrote me back a one-line response that said, where there's a will, there's a way. And that was her way of saying, you can do it, kid. Get in there. And if you work hard, you'll figure this out. If you believe that this is the right course for you, you can figure this out. Her life was about perseverance. She was discriminated against in so many ways and at so many junctures in her life. When she graduated, tied for first in her law school class, no New York City firm would offer her a job. She was a woman, she was a mother, and she was Jewish. As she said, that was 3 strikes too many. But she wound up on the Supreme Court. Why? Because she persevered. And you saw this in the later years of her life as she had tremendous health struggles, but kept trying to serve and continued to work incredibly hard. You saw this when she presided over arguments from a hospital bed in May of 2020. And we all saw this when she went to the bench to deliver an opinion the morning after her husband died, which to this day still blows me away. She taught me to engage with those with whom you disagree. This is a pretty important one and very timely in its own way. Justice Scalia was one of her closest friends, and people don't often believe this, but it's true. And one of the things that she celebrated about their friendship was that he pushed her to think through her ideas better, to make her arguments stronger. And so at his memorial, for example, she gave a speech in which she talked about how helpful his dissent in her VMI, to her VMI opinion was to her. It was, as she said, a zinger, but it made her go back and work harder on her original draft majority opinion. And by the time it was finished, it was ever so much better, she said. She also taught me to be kind. And this is something that a lot of people may not know about her, but she was one of the kindest human beings I've ever known. There were notes to celebrate every milestone. There were gifts for weddings and children. She had t-shirts made with the Supreme Court seal that said RBG Grand Clerk on them. And every time you had a child, you got one of those t-shirts. It was, I like to joke, almost reason to have more kids, so you could get more of the t-shirts. She also was there for you in difficult times. And I remember one time in particular that our family was going through a really difficult period. And she wrote a note that really helped carry me through some very difficult months. I also remember that I told her about my grandmother after my interview in which she hired me. And I explained sheepishly to her that I had to explain to my grandmother who Justice Ginsburg was. My grandmother had not finished high school and did not follow the Supreme Court, shall we say. And Justice Ginsburg wrote me back a letter in which she included a card for my grandmother and said, I'm very much looking forward to having Amanda come and work for me. Now, who does that? My grandmother had it framed and it hung in a prized spot in her living room until the day she died. I'm happy that I have that now in my possession. Justice Ginsburg taught me about bringing others along and lifting them up. I can tell lots of stories about this, but I'll just refer back to how she used her position to help make sure that Herma's book was published. She taught me to choose a partner who is very much in your corner. She talked with great affection in the interview about Marty, saying he was her biggest booster, and he was. And when we were working on the book at the end, she asked me to put more about Marty in the introduction. That's how in love she was with him, even in those last months. And it was a remarkable thing to be able to watch the two of them together. And it made quite an impression on me and on so many of her law clerks. We all talk about this. And Marty was really a man ahead of his time. He valued her work as much as his own. He supported her and he pushed for her to be on the Supreme Court. He was really her biggest fan. He once said, "I have been supportive of my wife since the beginning of time, and she has been supportive of me. It's not sacrifice, it's family." And that is a window into this remarkable partnership that I think was a huge part of her success and her accomplishments. And she would be the first person to tell you that. Finally, she taught me to make the most of every day. I let her talk to you a lot about this, about how when she survived and they came through Marty's cancer, they decided to live a good life, a rich and full life. And that they did. They loved opera and the arts and travel and food. They were a joy to be around. I can talk about going to the opera with her. I can talk about eating and Marty's incredible cooking, having them to dinner. And this is another story about Marty's devotion. She loved to drink Campari and soda. And a lot of people don't have Campari in their bars. So Marty would always come to dinner parties with a flask of Campari just in case. That's the level of his devotion to her. But it's also a window into how much fun they were. So let me wrap up and then let's have some questions if people want to put questions in the chat. She was still teaching me at the very end. We worked on the book right up until 3 weeks before she passed away. That's when we submitted the manuscript. And over that summer, before she passed in September of 2020, she was still asking for work from me in the hospital like she had done 20 years earlier when I was her law clerk. She was still very aggressively marking up drafts with edits, almost as much as she had 20 years ago, which is a little embarrassing. But it shows that maybe I still have a lot of improvement myself to do. But it also shows that she was still very much at the top of her game. She even edited my cover emails to her with the drafts attached, which her assistants had printed out for her. I'm particularly embarrassed about that, but I think it's kind of funny that she was doing that. She was excited about the book coming out. She was even more excited about Herma's book coming out. And I remember our final conversation, the last time we spoke. It was, as you can remember, summer of 2020, the middle of the pandemic. No vaccines yet, things were grim. And she asked me whether my children were going to be going back to school online or whether they would be going to school in person. And then she talked to me about how worried she was about all kids who are being so deeply affected by the pandemic. And that, I think, is a really important window into who Justice Ginsburg was and what was on her mind at the end of her life. She was thinking about others, and she was thinking about the future. And I hope that our book gives people a window into more of who she was and inspires them to carry on the work that she was so passionate about and she cared so much about. So I'd welcome any questions if people have particular things they would like to ask me about or have me speak to.
Oh, Amanda, now you got me in tears again. That was so awesome. I don't see questions yet in the chat, but I forgot to mention at the get-go that at the bottom of your screen, you can hover over it and a chat window, if you click on it, will appear. And you are welcome to submit a question, which I will read. But in the meantime, I guess I will start us off with the question that I know so many of us have asked over and over and over again. Can you talk about why she didn't resign?
You know, I get asked this every time I talk about her, and I understand it. And I think particularly as time goes on, if anything, we want to know more. We want to delve deeper into this decision. I didn't talk to her about this. What I can say is that this is someone who deeply loved her country and loved being a public servant. And I think that deep devotion to country and love of country came from, as I said earlier, how this country had welcomed her family. You know, she was a first generation child of immigrants and grandchild of immigrants on each side. And her family fled the horrors of Europe in the 1930s to come to the United States. And you see, and she talks about this in the book, in her lifetime, a child of a bookkeeper in the garment district winds up on the Supreme Court. And that's a pretty extraordinary story. That's an American story. And she was ferociously proud of the country that had made this opportunity available to her family and given them refuge and given her these opportunities. And I think for that reason, it was really hard for her to walk away. She loved the job. All of her clerks can tell you that. And I think also probably she didn't think that things would turn out the way that they did on a lot of different ways, in a lot of different ways, political, her health, etc. It's unfortunate now that she did not get to go out the way she did. It's obviously enormously unfortunate for lots of reasons, not the least of which is the current makeup of the Supreme Court that resulted. But I also think it's unfortunate because she didn't get a real retirement. And I think that would have been something that would have been really special and well earned.
Okay, thank you. I know a lot of us still grapple with that, and we're looking at Justice Breyer and wondering what's going on there. There's one question here. The justices generally seem now to be working hard to reassure America that the court is above politics. How do you think Justice Ginsburg would react to that position?
You know, it's interesting. There are a lot of speeches out there that the justices are giving from both sides of the aisle saying we're not a political body. And you do kind of, as a scholar of the court, as someone who's studied its history, you do kind of scratch your head when you see so many of these speeches being given. Why do they feel the need to go on the road to say this? It does make you wonder. It does make you wonder. I'm currently working on a paper about the court's COVID decisions. And I'm having a really hard time trying to find consistency in them. So it's a very interesting time, is the best word I think I can use, the most polite word I can use, about what is happening in the court. We see the court taking right now a lot of emergency motions and cases, way more than it ever has. We see the court deciding really important and in some cases unresolved questions through emergency motions, which is something we've not seen before. And we see a court that is fairly inconsistent on certain issues. So we're getting really intensive scrutiny of pandemic regulations that limit religious worship, but we're not seeing that for prisons that are rampant with COVID. And we're not seeing concern about how hard it is to get an abortion in the pandemic. And we're not seeing concern about voting rights at the same measure during the pandemic. So it is challenging to look at the court right now and not feel like there are a lot of politics influencing what it's doing. In terms of what Justice Ginsburg would say, I can think of a number of decisions recently where I think she would have been a very loud dissenter. But we've seen some really angry dissents from some of her colleagues, so maybe she would have just joined some of those. I think one thing that is really quite interesting is in some of the recent voting cases, in particular I'm thinking of, but also reproductive rights cases, you see Justices Sotomayor and Kagan quoting RBG extensively, as if to say, we're going to keep her voice as part of this conversation, and she would be as outraged as we are about these certain developments.
Another question. Thank you for that very insightful answer, by the way. What did RBG consider to be her biggest mistake from which she was perhaps able to grow? Good question.
That's a great question. I'm not sure I know the answer. I'm not sure I know the answer to that question. Perhaps, I don't know, but perhaps at the end of her life, she regretted not leaving the court earlier, while Obama was president. I don't know. I have to think about that, because I'd never asked her that question, and now I'm regretting that. I wish I had.
It's okay. It's a good question to think about.
Great question.
But it's also nice to think maybe she worked so hard to get everything the way she wanted it that she might have had trouble herself thinking. I don't know. She was pretty humble, so she probably would have had an answer. Gee, I don't see any other questions coming in. Is there anything else that you are frequently asked that we haven't thought to ask you?
Let's see. Well, I'm trying to think.
I mean, I could ask you, do you want to be a judge?
Go ahead. I'm sorry?
Would you like to be a judge?
Well, you know what? I will tell a story, and I will tell a story that brings you into the conversation, or your daughter, I should say. As some of you may know, our hosts have a daughter who is a prominent and extraordinary judge in her own right, and is a friend of mine. And I remember having her come and talk to my students. And she had clerked for Justice O'Connor. And she was asked the question at her confirmation hearings, if I remember correctly, about why it matters to have representation of women and our diverse society in general on the bench. And your daughter, I recall, said, because of her, and pointed at Justice O'Connor, who had come and sat behind her at her confirmation proceedings. And that is the same story that I think most women lawyers my age would say, that those of us who were born in the early 70s, who saw Sandra Day O'Connor put on the Supreme Court in 1981, said, oh, I can be a lawyer. I'm going to do that. And it was a really powerful moment in our lives. And Justice Ginsburg, in the time that I interviewed her, I meant to say this and I forgot, I asked her, when you were a kid, we know from her papers that she was writing for her school paper at the age of 13 about the UN Charter, Magna Carta, the Bill of Rights, the English Bill of Rights. This is somebody who you would have, if you were teaching them today, you would say, kid, you're going to be a lawyer. But I asked her, I said, were you thinking about being a lawyer when you were 13? And she said, no, because there weren't women lawyers. That didn't exist. That wasn't something that was there. And it was so different by the time that I was born. And in large measure, a lot of that starts with Justice O'Connor, but all the other women by the time then, we reach adulthood and come into the profession. There are so many. So there are so many amazing role models out there. And that wave of women, O'Connor, Ginsburg, and their cohort, they really changed the face of the legal profession.
Oh, well, thank you for that on several levels. Okay, I see two more questions. I heard, I'm not sure, I heard a guest who wrote on Supreme Court corporate decisions on Democracy Now! Say that Justice Ginsburg was conservative in her decisions. Is that true? Her corporate decisions.
I don't think that's always true. Another thing that I've been working on lately is a little piece about Justice Ginsburg and her decisions in the procedure and federal jurisprudence context. And as I think about her decisions about access to justice, which are procedure decisions, they're the kinds of decisions that don't make the front page of the New York Times, but I actually think are a really important window into how a justice thinks about the machinery of the courts. In those cases, she was a fairly regular voice for opening up access to the courts and making it easier to bring lawsuits. And I'm thinking in particular of the class action context. There was a big case involving Walmart and a class-wide attempt to sue Walmart for gender discrimination in hiring and promotions. And the court reached a decision in which they sided with Walmart and effectively threw out the suit. And on at least part of that, Justice Ginsburg wrote a rather scathing dissent in which she said, no, this is all wrong. And she had a few more in later cases. And she similarly wrote opinions in the arbitration context, where the court has routinely made it very hard to get around arbitration agreements to sue employers and corporations and consumer contracts, et cetera. And she was almost always on the side of the consumer, the employee, et cetera, the proverbial little guy. So I wouldn't necessarily agree with that assessment. I think there are probably examples that support the assertion, but I can think of a lot of examples that go against it.
Okay, what would RBG have? Would RBG have supported the efforts to enlarge the court?
This is a great question to which I don't know the answer. I could only speculate. It's a hard question even to speculate on, because I think for a lot of people who now support expanding the court, it's really only a position that many people have come to since the death of RBG and her replacement by Justice Barrett. And so it's really hard for me to speculate what the justice would have thought about the question without trying to get inside her mind in that context, which is really hard for me to do. She was someone who loved the court as an institution, who believed in the court as an institution, who tried to work within institutions to make change. So I think in that regard, she wouldn't have jumped quickly onto the bandwagon of let's expand the court. But I also think she would be very, very unhappy with the direction the court is going in right now. So I don't know.
Yeah. Well, I see no more questions, and I don't even know where to begin to thank you for this. I just feel like we just got a special tutorial like delivered straight to us of information that, despite our reading and the movies and everything we've heard, we learned even more tonight about RBG and miss her even more. So I really appreciate your being with us. I'm sorry we couldn't do it in person, but maybe your next book will come soon and we'll try again. So thank you so much. Oh, I should say that we are recording this. It will be posted on YouTube. We don't have a great way for distributing the link, but if you want to, you can write to info@berkeleycityclub.org, I think. And we will send you the link, or if you know Professor Tyler, you can write to her and she will send it to you, or we'll get it to you one way or the other. But again, thank you so much and have a nice night. Everybody else is saying, oh, there, it's info@berkeleycityclub.com, not .org. Okay, and everybody's saying thank you for a fabulous session. So
Thank you.
take care. Thank you. Good night, everyone.
Good night. Thank you.